Welcome back to Manuscript Minutes. I'm Kaylen.
And I'm Courtney, and today we will be discussing how parchment is made and how that relates to natural features in the animal's skin.
Making parchment from any animal source will leave behind artifacts that derive from the state of the animal's skin before production, as well as artifacts from the production itself. Let's consider the naturally occurring artifacts first.
All skins have external hair sides from which the hair was removed by slaking the skins in lime water. The subcutaneous fat residues, by contrast, had to be scraped from the internal flesh sides of the skin. In the best parchment, one aimed for a consistent appearance, but hair sides are typically darker and yellower than flesh sides. One can see the difference when turning the pages in this large Spanish choir book. Notice how the openings alternate light to dark, light to dark.
It was conventional to arrange the leaves so that the hair faced hair and the flesh faced flesh.
This feature of manuscript production was known as the Rule of Gregory, after American New Testament scholar Caspar Benet Gregory. When a flesh side faced a hair side, it often indicates that a page was either lost or canceled.
Sometimes, when a hair side faces the flesh side, that is an example of when a page could have been canceled. A canceled page has been deliberately removed, usually because of a copying error, but sometimes to recycle a blank leaf. While bifolia, quires, and complete books usefully demonstrate the rule of Gregory, a single folio of a manuscript can illustrate the darker hair side and lighter flesh side of the membrane. In this case, the page was not canceled. We know this by reading the text on the page. Since the lyrics to the song continue from the left page to the right, we know that the page was not canceled. If you were to read the text and the text did not match, then you would know that the page was indeed canceled.
Animals suffered disease and injury, and their healed skin can sometimes exhibit thick scars. Scar tissue is tougher and much less elastic than normal skin. After being soaked in lime water and stretched on a frame called a hearse, the scar typically falls off, leaving a hole.
It is tempting to assume that two holes close together represent the bite of another animal, but such artifacts may simply be due to parasitical insects. The common cattle grub and hornfly burrow into the skin of the cattle, for example. In this example, parasites left small holes in the skin that subsequently healed, but which remained visible in the parchment.
Here is an example of where holes created by insects completely healed over, and we can see it by putting the manuscript on a light box, which illuminates all the imperfections in the parchment.
Because the wet parchment is stretched on a frame, the shape of any hole left behind will be distorted, usually becoming ovoid.
Holes are hard to repair while stitching it, so one has to be careful to not cut the wet parchment while scraping it.
Gashes and cuts also heal, and when the scar falls off, they can leave narrower openings in the parchment that can be stitched up to prevent them from widening as the skin gets stretched.
This brings us to the second part of this podcast, in which we will discuss the evidence for the artisanal production of parchment.
Understanding the process will allow you to recognize the material evidence of its preparation.
This is an example of where a tear likely occurred during the preparation process. The parchmenter would have made a quick stitch in the vellum to prevent the tear from becoming any larger. The holes from this stitch are slightly ovoid because of the timing of when this stitch was made.
The wet skins were scraped with a curved blade called a lunellum or lunarium. This term, which derives from the word luna or moon, refers to the blade's crescent shape.
One could push it into the wet skin without cutting. Shaving off layers of tissue was done when the skin was either wet or dry. Evidence provided using a simple light box reveals how the crescent-shaped curls were shaved off.
This is an example of what can happen when the parchmenter pushes too hard when using a lunellum. This scuff is so deep into the vellum that it almost tore through the page, hence its unusually thin appearance in relation to the rest of the skin. The curved shape visible in this scuff is a telltale sign that it was created by use of a lunellum.
In this particular instance we just viewed, one could see how pushing hard to scrape near thicker auxiliary skin could cause a cut.
The harder one pressed into the skin, the more convex the cut would be. Given the rotundity of this particular cut, the parchmenter was pushing very hard.
As the skin dries, its collagen fibers align to make parchment. While durable, parchment is susceptible to humidity. Many years in a picture frame left this manuscript page badly cockled, the result of humidity penetrating the edges. The straps on manuscript books were intended, among other things, to keep its parchment flat. While these straps have certainly seen their better days, they were a crucial component in keeping the pages in this book as flat as possible. Despite relatively insignificant damages to the pages, especially around the edges, the pages are still able to maintain their shape from the pressure applied by the straps during storing.
Another example of parchment being susceptible to cockling is shown with this leaf. Due to humidity, the right outer margin of the parchment has been creased. In this video, we can see Kaylen lightly tugging on the outer corners of the margin to display this. In the medieval period, it seems that both round and square frames were used for stretching the wet skins. A pebble was wrapped in a gathering of wet skin and tied to a peg on the frame that could be turned to tighten it.
Getting the tension wrong could lead to a warp like this one. A slit was cut to relax the parchment and make it lay flat. The cockling often encountered in outside margins of manuscripts may be attributed to the uneven tension of the drying skins. When preparing the parchment to be turned into a manuscript, parchmenters will sometimes intentionally scuff the vellum using a small pumice stone. This prepares the vellum to receive ink and ensures that anything written on the parchment will have a better chance of adhering. Here is an example of what the parchment looks like on the lightbox after this pumice stone treatment. You can see how the striations run in two directions on the vellum as the parchmenter pushed the stone across the parchment. Here is an even more extreme example of the kind of marks that the striations from the pumice stone can leave on a manuscript. When a manuscript is placed on a lightbox, it becomes much easier to see just how dynamic the thickness of the vellum can be, even on the same piece of parchment. The lightbox indicates that some places on the parchment are much thinner and more translucent, showing where the parchmenter would have scraped harder during preparation. At this stage, one could patch any large holes as needed. This was not normally done as it was labor-intensive. Most of the time, scribes simply wrote around the holes, yet this page has a nearly invisible patch. Sometimes, instead of patching the holes, whoever was writing on the manuscript would just mine the hole and write around it, as we can see in this example here.
Here is an additional example of patching. As you can see, there are two very large patches, one down the far left margin and another on the bottom margin of the parchment. It is evident that this manuscript folio is from the Middle Ages, as the decorations are painted over the patch. This was a common practice. With this particular folio, one would have never known that the page was patched without the aid of this lightbox.
When the parchment was cut from the frame, a decision was made whether to treat some of the thick axillary parchment as part of the page. To understand how this works, please refer to this podcast by Eric Quackle. The thick, inflexible sections of axillary skin are found in the margins since they could not be written on. Here, we are using a caliper, as we did in our previous video, to demonstrate the difference in thickness. In this case, the axillary skin was about 50% thicker than the surrounding skin.